Just reorient some things. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the November 2024 Access and Stewardship Committee meeting for California Four-Wheel Drive Association. This is kind of a special edition because we are focusing on the Range of Light National Monument. Um, we talk about a lot of different public land access issues in this monthly series. So if you're a member of Cal4, welcome back. And if it's your first time, welcome for the first time. If you're not a member of Cal4 and you're here, I'm so happy to see you. We, of course, advocate for public access for motorized recreation interests throughout the state of California on all public lands. But we also advocate for public access for all users. So for all recreation, for all multiple uses. We're not isolated and focused to motorized recreation because the bottom line is our members love doing all the other things in the forests, in the deserts, on the coast, wherever we have motorized recreation. There's a lot of other fun to be had as well. And we do advocate for responsible recreation, whatever the activity may be. We're heavily involved in stewardship projects and taking care of the land that we recreate on. So all of these issues, especially the issues of national monuments, are very near and dear to our hearts. And so with that, a warm welcome to everybody who's not a member of Cal4. If you want to join in and support the fight to keep public land access open, then we welcome you to join, even if you don't drive an OHV. And I hope that you'll chime in and share things about other uses and interests that you have for this proposed national monument as we're talking tonight as well. So I'm going to throw it out there a few times just as a disclaimer that, in the event that Deanna Wolf from Unite the Parks is attending tonight, which I'm hoping she is, I just want to reiterate a warm welcome to meet with her because we've had some back and forth exchanges and comments on Facebook. And I think we'd have a much more productive conversation if we actually met. So you might hear me mention that a few times throughout our meeting tonight. And so thank you for your patience. Hear that repeated. Okay, so without further ado, what we're discussing tonight is the proposed Range of Light monument. We're going to focus on a few different areas. There's a lot to be discussed in relationship to this monument, but we can't possibly cover it in an hour plus or minus. So we will focus on the context of the scope of the monument and size and scale and what is at stake. We'll go into some of the details about the Range of Light proposal. We'll talk about how this impacts each of us and the varied multiple uses, including motorized recreation and also all the others in our beautiful forests. And then we'll talk about some action items and, excuse me, what you can do to oppose this monument if indeed you are opposed, which kind of assuming most people here are. All right, so Range of Light, which a good friend of mine recently cleverly referred to as the Range of Darkness, which I would agree, because there's nothing lighthearted about this monument in the perspective of somebody who loves to use and access our public lands for multiple benefits. So the proposed Range of Light has been advocated for by the Unite the Parks group. This group actually has been around for a long time, well over 10 years. I think I first heard of it maybe 13 years ago. And there's been some ebbs and flows in regard to the activity of the group and how it's been advocating for the monument. But it has throughout that time been led by Deanna Wolf. And the scope, the size, the shape, the intent of the proposed monument has remained consistent throughout that time as well. So this piece of land comprises over 1.4 million acres, which is huge. It would contain all the land between the southern border of Yosemite National Park, which I don't know if y'all can see my cursor as I'm pointing on the screen, but I'm circulating it here on the borderline. It was stretched from Yosemite National Park on the north to Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park on the south. And then it would stretch all the way through the existing borders of Sierra National Forest on the west, which would thus include many communities like Shaver Lake, Huntington Lake, Big Creek. Why am I forgetting it now? The lake to the south of us. Bass Lake, Oakhurst, all those areas would be contained. There's also some kind of small little parcels, like you're seeing these green shapes encircled throughout the west. And I've seen some different variations of the map that do or don't include those little like spots and spurs. So I don't understand honestly the nature of what those are and how they're mapped in inclusion to the Range of Light Monument, but there may be some additional lands outside of Sierra National Forest proper. And then on the east, it would border Inyo National Forest and other wilderness areas like the Owens River, Owens Waterhead on the east side. So if anybody is not asking questions or participating in the discussion, I do ask if you unmute yourselves just so that we can keep things quiet while I'm talking. But if you have a question, unmute yourself and pop in. But if you wouldn't mind keeping yourself muted without any questions being asked, I'd super appreciate it. So the Range of Light Monument, I'm just gonna quit.
Hey, Rose, you need to mute those people. They're not, especially ones on their phones.
Yeah, I'm going through the list right now.
Especially Brian's iPhone. We'll call him out.
Yeah, it's saying Brian's iPhone.
No worries. This is the joys of online webinars in larger attendee format. Okay, I think we got that taken care of. So, thank you all for your patience as we got that sorted. So again, feel free to pop in, but just unmute yourself when you're ready to pop in. Okay, so the Range of Light Monument would encompass the whole of Sierra National Forest, and it would shift public land management from the Forest Service to the National Park Service, which is a pretty big and important issue, and we'll dive into some more detail on that. For some context, we actually have 18 existing national monuments in California, and that the sum total of all the land in these national monuments is over 3 million acres. Some of these are pretty vast in size, encompassing hundreds of thousands of acres, and some are smaller. Some of the smaller ones that are really quite appropriate as far as a national monument goes includes like the Fort Ord National Monument. That's a historic military base. That's a very appropriate use of monument designation. And there's, let's see, that might be the only one here in California that's really in that scope. Then we have a monument like in the Cascade-Siskiyou that actually crosses the California-Oregon border. And so we have some cross-jurisdictional things there. Another interesting point is Pinnacles National Monument was actually upgraded, as conservationists would say, it was upgraded to a national park in 2013. So part of the purpose of a national monument is the potential to convert it to a national park down the road. And that may be something that would be considered for Range of Light, since it is planned to be managed by the National Park Service. And with the Unite the Parks agenda, their goal is to have a national parks-like structure and set of policies for the Range of Light. Outside of the 18 existing national monuments in California, there are 5 new proposed national monuments, which in sum actually would add another full 3 million acres if they were all designated. So that would bring our total in this state to 6 million acres, which is a vast amount of public land. Range of Light is the biggest among those, totaling over 1.4 million acres. But these other monuments I want to call out and have you pay close attention to as well for just a moment. The Chuckwalla and Quashan National Monuments are both in Southern California. They collectively encompass over 1 million acres, and they do border each other. So essentially it'd be like one super monument if they were both designated. We'll get into all the details about presidential proclamation and designation of monuments, but these 3, Range of Light, Chuckwalla, and Quashan, are the top candidates among those in California for designation through presidential proclamation. And so it's important that we pay attention to all of these. And tonight we're focusing on range of light, but we will have some additional focus on Chuckwalla and Quishon in the coming weeks and potentially in our next access and stewardship meeting. So some additional context, I'm going to show you some maps of some of these monuments. There were these 5. I actually don't have a map of Titla. I haven't been able to find one, but it's about 200,000 acres and it's located up in the Shasta region. Um, so for the ones that we do have maps, there's of course the range of light, and we just talked about this map a moment ago on the other side. Um, there's also the Chuckwalla, which is bordering Joshua Tree National Park on the north. It kind of swings around the Chocolate Mountains and then borders the Quishon proposed monument, which if you follow this southern line out, you can kind of see a shaded area. That's basically the Quishon, that corner down here that's shaded. I'll show you a map of that in a moment. But I wanted to note that national monuments also often have some very interesting resource use implications. And with the Chuckwalla Monument, something that's quite interesting, but not typically discussed in public circles, is that the Chocolate Mountains contains the richest gold deposit, and it's possibly the richest gold deposit in the entire United States. There was some very contentious issues surrounding the Chocolate Mountains during Dianne Feinstein's term as senator. And in fact, this land was ultimately seized and taken over by government entities. And so there is little to no public access within the Chocolate Mountain region right now. There is a artillery range, there's a gunnery and a shooting practice range for the military in the Chocolate Mountains. And that also, unspokenly serves the purpose of keeping all that gold very, very secure. so whenever we're looking at national monuments, I want to point this out specifically because we want to not only look at the uses of the land, we also want to look at the uses of the resources. And I think it's no accident that this proposed monument borders the Chocolate Mountains, where all that gold is just sitting, apparently, as far as we know. Also, near the Chuckwalla Mountains is probably the largest lithium deposit in the United States. So within and around the Salton Sea is a massive area that is prospected for lithium mining. In fact, the Lithium Valley Coalition, I believe it's called, or Lithium Valley Project, is in development now. It's a $1.85 billion project that will seek to extract enough lithium that they say would cover the needs of the United States as well as 40% of the planet indefinitely. And I don't know how they measure indefinitely, but that's a very, very long time. So all those resources sitting there around existing protected lands like national parks and proposed protected lands like national monuments is something to pay attention to. With the Quishon, as I mentioned, it is in the southeast corner of California. The northern border up here is where we saw that line from the Chuckwalla. You can see that shape there, and then you see it mirrored here. This is a 390,000 acre proposed monument that would border Glamis sand dunes on the west, which is a premier, very high value OHV riding and recreation site in Southern California. It would include and contain the Quishon Reservation, which is in the pink area down here in the far corner, and all that would border the California-Mexico border. And then on the east side, it would border Arizona and the Colorado River. There's also some really high value resources and the value of the Colorado River itself and all the issues surrounding that watershed that could potentially easily get wrapped up in this monument proposal as well. Finally, the Feather River Canyons Monument. This is located up in Northern California in the Plumas area. It is the scope and scale of size is unknown. The proponents for the monument have never stated an exact acreage, but from looking at the maps, it's about 400,000 and change. So it's at least 400,000 acres, if not more. Shown here on the map within this purple and red outline And so there's lots of very high value resources there. There's, of course, the Feather River watershed, as well as some very high value timberlands and recreational lands. So in the grand scope of things, the Range of Light is one of several national monuments. We're going to be taking some action, talking about taking action to oppose the Range of Light today, but I wanted to mention all this with the context in hopes that you'll also consider taking action against these other proposed monument designations. Uh, I'll talk more about the risk that we're facing with presidential proclamation, and then we'll have some more things to cover there. So a few more things for context. National monuments fall directly within the agenda and strategy for the 30 by 30 initiative. And I know from folks that I'm familiar with on this call that there are many who are already familiar with 30 by 30. But for those of you who are not, 30 by 30 is essentially a federal and state-driven agenda to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by the year 2030. And we're well on that way, not only within California, but within the entire US. The image that you're seeing on the left is a simulation that was presented to the United Nations, years ago. I think this was in 2014. The date is not on this map, but I have it on others. So at least a decade or so ago, it's been around for a long time. This concept was presented to the United Nations with the idea that 30% of lands would be very strictly conserved. That's what's shown in red. A large majority of additional lands would be very highly conserved. That's shown in yellow. And highly conserved means highly regulated use with so limited human use. There would be some normal use shown in green, but as you can see on this map, there are very tiny splotches of green sprinkled about the yellow and red. They're far less frequent. And the normal use we considered, urban areas, cities and townships, developed areas with homes and commerce, et cetera. And then, of course, we have existing Indian reservations and military reservations. And in this concept for 30 by 30, those would remain intact. 30 by 30 is something that's very important to pay attention to in relationship to national monuments because monuments form a core strategy between the two. And the correlation was actually defined explicitly in the Biden administration's 30 by 30 conservation agenda, which is also at times called the America the Beautiful Plan. And so if you Google any of those terms, you'll find the executive orders, you'll find the statements from Biden. They're all out there publicly available regarding his position on 30 by 30 and his efforts during his presidency to advance it. There were former efforts to advance it through Obama and Clinton and prior presidencies as well. But it was more formally recognized and explicitly named during the Biden administration. So Biden has himself established and expanded 9 national monuments during his term as president, and he's just under, I think, 100,000 acres of exceeding the acreage of any president to have designated lands as national monuments. And so I have every expectation, as most people do, that he's going to want to, cement that legacy and be the one that designates the most land as national monuments. 2 of the monuments that are very well known that he designated include the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah and the Avi Kwame Monument in Nevada, which actually borders California in part. And that line comes very close to Quishon and Chuckwalla, so that those 3 monuments together would almost be one big monument blob. In California, our governor, Gavin Newsom, has additionally very actively supported the 30 by 30 agenda. And there's actually a unique California specific plan through Newsom for 30 by 30. And the map that you're looking at on the right is from that California plan. The claim now is that about 24% and change of our lands have been conserved. However, I think that's actually missing quite a bit when you do calculations like you're seeing here in green what they're considering conserved areas. And that includes designated wilderness, some national parks, depending on how that park is managed. Some qualify as 30 by 30, some don't. And a few other public land designations and private lands that have been purchased for the purpose of conservation that kind of make up the sum change of that 24%. And so when you look at these two maps together, you can see that there's a definite intent in the 30 by 30 agenda to create some larger land areas and corridors. And in the map on the left, you can see, stretching from Washington State through Oregon and down through California. Basically, the Cascade and Sierra Nevada range is pretty largely in conserved status, according to their plan. It's mostly red with a very high content of yellow all around it. And then here in the map on the right, we're seeing that there's already some very large areas of that same region within California that is considered conserved. And these are the wilderness areas there. So the addition of the range of light would fall in this middle part of the state. Oh, didn't mean to move the map. In this middle part of the state and expand that sizably. And then Chuckwalla and Quashon down here would basically tie up the remainder of this open corner in the southeast bit of California into conserved status. So that's kind of the larger game plan and something to pay attention to. If you have any questions about the relationship between 30 by 30 and national monuments, I encourage you to just Google what's the relationship between them, and you'll find lots of articles and quotes and documents that very clearly demonstrate the correlation between the two. Okay, so before I go on, let me just quick pause and see, does anybody have questions or anything that they wanted to pipe in and share at this time?
I put them in the chat.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Uh, okay, Kevin, I see your question about the prospects of range of light. We'll talk about the probability and also action that we can be taken a little further on in the webinar in our time together. So I'll address it there. And Luke, yeah, we'll talk about why Unite the Parks wants to cover these monuments. I have some content on that. I encourage people to read the comments because there's some great bits of information in there, like from Michael Leaders about home insurance and fire. There's also some other information that's going to be helpful. So, all right, I'll keep peeking at chat periodically. David, question?
Rose, with your 30 by 30, the way you explained it, does the other aspects of like windmill projects or solar projects or even endangered species fall into play with that 24.4% of lands they already have gathered?
Yeah, great question. So the Endangered Species Act does relate to 30 by 30 because endangered species protections are one of many tactics that are used to advance land conservation. When we have landscapes that are designated as critical habitat, that often leads to other types of protections that then locks up multiple uses of that plot of land. And so there are, I know from looking at the map and my knowledge of endangered species in California that there are some key areas for endangered species that are held within here. How exactly they're factored into the calculation, I'm not sure on that. So just to be clear, I don't know how endangered species factor into their calculation of the total conserved lands. In regard to wind and solar developments, I don't believe that those lands are considered conserved because they're being used for an industrial purpose. And so there's just kind of an interesting irony, I think a bit of hypocrisy in the environmentalist movement in relationship to renewable energy development and conservation of land, because the production of renewable energy typically decimates the land. And if you look at large scale solar farms, there is almost nothing living on those plots of land. With wind farms, there's massive kill to birds and huge amounts of landscape that are graded down to bare earth in order to erect the windmills. So I don't believe that those are factored into conserved lands at all. But great question. Okay, I'm going to move on and then I'll be sure to pause for other questions in there. But if you have something that comes up, feel free to raise your hand as well. So when we're talking about monuments, there's two ways that they can be designated. One is through Congress, the other is through presidential proclamation. Those are the only two ways. Through Congress, a legislative bill has to be sponsored by an active member
Listen
of Congress.
of what this is about.
And that bill must be introduced and passed through Congress. That usually means it has to be reviewed by relevant committees, including the House Natural Resources Committee, Appropriations, as well as others. Designation through Congress really is the most appropriate channel for monuments because it forces our congressional representatives to include the will of their constituents in whether or not they take a position to support or oppose a monument. Not all of our elected officials are necessarily honorable in, representing their electeds, but many of them are. Most of them are, I would say. And so that's where it's very important that we're involved in outreaching our congressional representatives and telling them what we want, what we think, so that they know what their constituents are saying when there is a proposed monument like the Range of Light out there. The other route in which a monument can be designated is through presidential proclamation, and that's basically like a written decree. It's a paper that's signed by the president, it designates the monument, and it becomes live and active the day of signature. This is done using the Antiquities Act, which has been around for a long time, since 1906. And the intention of the Antiquities Act was to protect very small and specifically historically relevant sites. So the language of the Antiquities Act says that there must be a specified object of value, and that value has to be significant, quantifiable in a way that warrants designation as a monument, that thing should be set aside and preserved for perpetuity. It also must comprise the smallest necessary area. That's in the language of the Antiquities Act, so that the total land mass is as small as is possible, as small as is necessary to protect an object. So what we've seen happen, though, is the Antiquities Act has been pretty grossly abused by many presidents who have, typically some very radical environmentalist agendas. This includes not only Biden, but also Obama and Clinton, who all leveraged the Antiquities Act to designate multiple large-scale monuments. And like the Range of Light, many monuments in scale in these recent presidential eras are huge, by hundreds of thousands of acres, some well over millions of acres. I think one of the largest is about 2 million acres up in Alaska. So these massive, massive landscapes in which the object of value that's named is the landscape itself. And so that illustrates the trend and the intention of using monuments to advance the 30 by 30 initiative, because they're conserving whole landscapes. This, however, it's nothing short of a gross abuse of executive powers. This is not the way that the presidential function between our trio of balance of the executive, legislative, and congressional branches are intended to operate. It's an overreach of powers. And unfortunately, to date, we haven't had any president held accountable for overreach of powers in using the Antiquities Act, but we might see that change. There actually are some current lawsuits trickling their way through the courts that have some optimistic prospects for success to rein in the opportunity for presidents to use the Antiquities Act in this way to designate hundreds of thousands or millions of acres as monuments. So not all monuments are terrible. I know somebody mentioned in the chat that the Cesar Chavez Monument in California is of appropriate size. It really is. And that honors a significant part of California history that should be remembered. We also have some other examples, like the Abraham Lincoln House. It sits on about 2.3 acres. And that house is important. There are a lot of very important historic decisions and actions that were made during the Abraham Lincoln presidency. And so that's a great site to designate as a monument. In other issues, we have like some old forts, like the Fort Ord Monument, and some Indian sites like the ancestral Puebloan village in the Yucca House National Monument. It's a site in the Montezuma Valley where a whole village of, pre-modern era Native Americans lived between 900 and 1300 AD. The whole monument is about 33 acres, but there's some really, really important cultural artifacts and sites there. So that definitely warrants protection. And that's an appropriate use of the Antiquities Act. So just for comparison, those types of appropriate uses versus what we're seeing with the range of light and 1.4 million acres and just designating a whole mountain range as a monument are very, very different in scope and should not be compared like apples to apples. All right, so when we're thinking about the Range of Light Monument, I also wanted to point out some of the information that's been shared by Unite the Parks, and we'll go into some more of this as we're talking throughout our time tonight as well. But groups like Unite the Parks who propose a monument commonly try to make it sound like a really lovely idea. And this image is actually a screenshot of the webinar that Deanna Wolf, she's up here in the top right corner, and she's the leader of the Unite the Parks. She hosted this webinar a few weeks ago. She has stated in this webinar and at other times that motorized recreation will still be allowed in the range of light. Important to note though, only street legal vehicles would be permitted. And so that means all non-street legal OHV would be banned. That's pretty important. So it doesn't mean that OHV will continue like it currently does. In a similar way, she stated that dispersed camping would also be allowed. But the range of light also clearly intends to close all what they deem as unnecessary spur roads and less frequently used roads in order to reforest them. And it's those roads precisely that lead to dispersed camping. I know from living in this area for over 20 years that there's some really awesome dispersed camping down those little old logging roads and spur roads. There's tiny dirt roads that lead to some great fishing holes and hunting sites and places that you just can't get to easily on foot, or people who are disabled couldn't get to, period, without those roads intact. So that would be closed. Dispersed camping would be largely concentrated and restricted. And so to say that dispersed camping would still be allowed really isn't a fair statement or representation of their intent. Some other things that she stated is like, we want cowboys, but not cows. And that's pretty offensive to anybody who's in the cattle grazing realm. We have families who have, held and managed effectively and efficiently cattle grazing leases for many, many generations. And so to just remove all cattle from the landscape would not only harm our fuel reduction and wildfire prevention goals, it would also, wipe out generations of a sector of our economy and, shut down a large number of families' personal economy, what they've been doing for generation after generation for well over 100 years. So that's also a very unfair representation of their intent and pretty inconsiderate in regard to how the range of light would affect stakeholders. So we could walk through all of these items in detail, but those are a few that stand out. And we'll talk about other uses in some future slides. So I just wanted to mention that though, as we're talking through more of the context and impacts of the range of light proposal. So another important thing to consider in regard to this is that the range of light would remove management of this area of land from the Forest Service and hand it over to the National Park Service. And so we need to ask ourselves, what's the difference of that? The core difference is that the Forest Service operates under a multiple use mandate, which requires them to balance conservation with all multiple uses, including recreation, logging, concession uses like ski resorts and, pack outfits who take people out into the wilderness on horseback. All those uses are done in balance with conservation. And I would assert that they're done pretty well. Nothing's perfect, but they're done really well in Sierra National Forest specifically, as we compare it to other forests up and down the state. With the National Park Service, however, conservation is the #1 priority. And so their goal is primarily to preserve natural, cultural, and historical sites and ecosystems. They allow, by permit and by fee, public access where they deem it as low impact. So any high impact use, like motorized recreation, logging, broad scale camping, those sorts of things are what are usually very quickly eliminated. Only non-intrusive activities are permitted selectively. So there is hiking, there's some camping, and there's a very heavy emphasis on wildlife viewing, or being able to get to viewpoints and just look, but not touch. And then the ecological preservation as the primary goal places an emphasis on restoring natural conditions. So that's the hands-off approach to forest management that we see coming out of what's advocated for by many of our environmental groups. The non-impairment mandate is how the Park Service describes their role in public land management. And so they say that any action that might degrade the environment is then prohibited. So again, while Unite the Parks has said that, all these things will continue and be able to be used and done and enjoyed, the reality is that when you get down to the management policy, that's not really what happens in monuments, period, and especially in monuments that are managed by the National Park Service. So what is at stake? Some of the biggest things mentioned here are that, a change in multiple uses as the primary goal to conservation as the primary goal. It would also alter the nature of public involvement in public land management. And this one is very important because I think that we have many people on this call who have been involved in public comment for Forest Service projects. But public comment is very important and in fact required and necessary for the Forest Service to function. Through NEPA, which is NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, the Forest Service is required to take public comment throughout the planning and decision-making process for both large-scale land management plans as well as project-specific plans like a logging permit or maintenance or opening or closure of campsites or maintenance or opening or closing of trails. All of these things require detailed plans, and the public is invited to provide input on those plans as a requirement of Forest Service operations. With monument structure, though, there is some public comment required through the same law, NEPA. However, it is typically much less frequent and much less valued. The primary opportunity for public comment for a monument is in the initial planning phase. And what that looks like, there may be some people here who provided comment on Bears Ears National Monument, which happened recently. And we saw how there was a lot of public input given about all the different recreational uses and values and other uses of the land and things that people really love to do there. And those public comments were essentially ignored. And ultimately, the plan that was released as the final decision was exactly the plan that was proposed at the start. So public comment really didn't accomplish much of anything in regard to that monument planning process. And that's typical of the monument planning process. National monuments are not required in the same way as the Forest Service to take in public input and use that input to influence and shape the final decision that's made. Another big difference is that national monuments usually have very long-term plans that span many, many decades. And so if a plan is revised, there might be another opportunity for public input, but there might not be. It all depends on the agency who's managing that and what they decide to allow. If it is allowed, you're looking at, at least 20, sometimes 30 or more years in between the planning processes where any public input is taken. So essentially, it's kind of a more hushed and selective process for public input to be provided and then in how it's used. That in contrast to the Forest Service, where again, we have not only the large scale land management plans, but also the project specific plans. The large scale plans go through revision every 10 to 15 years. So it's much more frequent in turnover. And so basically the public is always involved in that land planning and use process. And in fact, my role with Cal4 is primarily to participate in the public land management process with the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, national parks, et cetera, on behalf of our association. But we have lots of members who are involved as individuals, and I would encourage everybody on this call to get involved in those planning processes if you're not already, because that is how we have our voice, and that is how we retain protection of our values for different types of land uses, recreation, et cetera. David, we have a lot. I'm still going to cover it here. So I see your hand. I'll stop in just a bit to see what you have to pipe in. But some other big areas of impact would be a pretty significant reduction in economic uses. The range of light proposal would eliminate logging. And for those who are familiar with our sawmill situation in California, we have 5 active sawmills, one of which is located in the Central California region. That's Terabella. And Terabella actually relies on production of 20 million board feet of lumber from Sierra National Forest just to maintain a viable operation year over year. And 20 million board feet might sound like a ton, like a heck of a whole lot. However, take this into context. In past decades, pre-1990s, before we had some pretty heavy restrictions put on logging, we had tens of billions of board acre of lumber taken out of our forests every single year. And that's not just California, that's of all forests, which are mostly in the West, but we had literally billions of board feet taken out, which when you whittle that down to our local area in the national forest, there was much, much more being taken and used than 20 million board feet. Since the closure of a lot of the logging activity, we've had so little timber activity and fuel reduction that we see, very heavily overly dense forests with so many trees standing per acre that you can barely walk through them, much less navigate in a road or a dirt bike or a mountain bike or on foot. And so that's part of what contributed to the creek fire. And so logging is very, very necessary for effective active forest management. And if we saw the Terabella mill go out of business, it would very dramatically and immediately impact our local area as well as the local economy. They have several hundred jobs that are wrapped up just within that mill itself. We also have some local biofuel plants, and so those would lose production from Sierra National Forest if the Range of Light Monument was designated. That would also detrimentally impact them. Additionally, the monument would charge the public for fees, so we would no longer have free entry as we do now to use our forest at any time throughout the year. We would have to pay a fee for entry, and then there would also be fees for most of the permitted uses within the monument itself. So the bottom line is this really is a federal land grab. By taking away the opportunity for ongoing and significant public input within public land management planning, you're basically taking the public's role out of public land. And then by taking away the economic uses, the opportunities for recreation, and charging fees for entry and use, you're basically handing over control of that area of land to the managing entity, which in this case would be the National Park Service. So this is a very quick and effective way for the government to seize significantly more control of public lands, which is the definition of a land grab. And that's what we're facing with this monument, as well as with the others that have been proposed. Okay, let me pause there. And David, you had something you wanted to ask or share?
Yeah, thank you, Rose. Do you have any knowledge of what the success rate on mitigation, if any, on monument status, past or present, would be or has been?
By mitigation, do you mean like reversal?
Reversal or just plan, I guess planning, if there's any. I don't know how the monument status takes place as far as them moving forward, what it would take for us other than just mailing and writing people. I mean, is there an actual action that we could do that would be less frowned upon by maybe tribal organizations or any other people that may have interest in the land as well?
Well, yeah, if there are tribal interests or other groups that are advocating for the monument, I think it's always good to engage with them and have dialogue and ask them why. I am not under the impression that we have heavy tribal support for the Range of Light. I believe there are some tribal organizations, which may or may not be housed within the tribes themselves, that are advocating for this. But as far as local tribes, if anybody knows of local tribes who are supporting, I'd be very interested in learning about that, because per my range of knowledge, I have not seen that. As far as opposing it, anyhow, if we're encountering people who advocate for it and we're opposing it, I would encourage talking with them. As far as like you mentioned, mitigating the prospects for the monument, really what we have at our disposal to do now is to contact our representatives at the local, state, and national level. And that's exactly what we'll be getting into, is the how to do that at the end of our time together tonight. Because this has already gone through Congress, which I'll go into all the details of that again in just a minute, but it's gone through Congress and it's failed. It's not going to be approved through Congress. The only route for it to be approved is by presidential proclamation. That is a real risk given the nature of the Biden administration and the fact that he's in the twilight of his term. That's often when monuments are designated. So it's possible that a future presidency could reverse or eradicate a monument designation. However, there's a whole lot of complications with that in regard to having the monument get tied up in court and litigation, and then looking at how the management planning is already in progress and potentially implemented through the course of the before and during of that litigation and monument reversal process. So it gets messy quick.
Has there been any litigation on this, or?
Well, not on this specifically because it has not been designated yet, but there has been litigation on other monuments. And one of the prominent recent examples is Barry's Ears, which again, I'll actually talk about that in a little bit as well.
Okay, thank you, Rose.
Yeah, great question. Okay, David Hess, I see your hand. I'm going to go on for the sake of time and then loop back to you in just a minute. But on the note that David Law was just asking about in regard to going through Congress or going through the president and prospects for success of proclamation, I did want to point out that this particular monument, the Range of Light, has already been proposed through Congress. It was presented as HR 9600 in the last legislative session in 2022, and it failed. A congressional representative by the name of Jackie Spear presented it. She was not able to gather enough support for it to be moved through Congress. The House Natural Resources Committee just flat out rejected it, and a very large number of congressional representatives also just flat out rejected it. So in our current political climate of our existing Senate and Congress, and then what we're looking towards the next legislative session for, we've had a bunch of new leaders elected in this last November 5th election. And in that political climate, I don't foresee that this or any national monument will be approved through Congress. So the only route is through presidential proclamation. And that's where we have a very serious question to face in regard to what the Biden administration will do. Let's talk a little bit more about Unite the Parks. Unite the Parks is a group that, again, has been around for quite a few years. They've changed their name a few times, and so this is the most recent iteration where they kind of rebranded themselves as Unite the Parks in order to emphasize unifying Yosemite National Park and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park in that north-south and east-west range. So there's a lot of information on their website that talks about the scope of goals for the monument. They have economic reports. They share the proponents' perspectives on timber and vegetation management. They talk about recreation and other uses. However, when you read through it, which I really, really strongly urge everybody to read through it, we best equip ourselves when we're fully informed. And so we want to know what they're saying on the other side as well. When you read through it, I think what you'll find, as I have, is that a lot of information doesn't equate to a lot of details. There's a lot of words that are shared, but there's not a lot of meat to those words that give you, as a member of the public, a clear idea of what's the impact. So you say recreation will continue. How and where and when? You say that logging will be banned, but the forest will be healthier. How will the forest be healthier? How in the world do some of the comparisons that you'll see about wildfire facts and their ideas for hands-off management, how in the world does that equate to less risk of future catastrophic fire? There's a number of issues in here that If you are a private landholder or if you own a business within the footprint of the proposed monument, if you love to recreate, camp, hunt, fish, drive your OHV, whatever it may be, look for details on what would impact you, and you'll pretty quickly see that there really aren't many details there. So with that being said, I wanted to also show this map. This is the most detailed map I've been able to find in regard to uses. And I know, Mike, earlier you were asking about a map that showed borders and how that fits into geography. I really don't have anything more specific than the one that I showed you earlier. And I know that Jeff Aiello has a pretty good map that he's posted on Talk of the Hill on Facebook that does show towns and some more specific areas within the borders. So that would be a good one to look at too. I didn't pull that over to this PowerPoint. Actually, I didn't have time quite to do that, but that'd be a good one to reference. Anyway, for uses, this is what is shown by the Unite the Parks group as what would be permitted. And as you can see, over 1.4 million acres, which is vast. If this is what would be permitted, it's a very, very small percentage of what we currently enjoy. And so this illustrates precisely what our concerns are, is that they're going to pull back and restrict permitted uses in such a way that they're very, very concentrated to specific areas. So basically, we'll be able to get out to places and then look at the rest of the land. You might be able to walk out and hike or backpack into more areas that you can't see by motorized vehicle, but you have to have the physical ability and the time and finances to be able to take those more extended hikes and backpacking trips. And so to show this as the equivalent of what we use and enjoy now is a very false representation of reality. By comparison, this is a map, current map of Sierra National Forest. And as you can see, there's no way to adequately see this on a PowerPoint screen. It is so detailed. The Sierra National Forest is outlined in red. You can see all sorts of little squiggles and lines of routes. Those are not only, the dark lines are actual roads, like Highway 168 that goes up to Edison and Dinky Road that goes out towards Vashon and Courtright. But all these other squiggles and lines, those are all of our OHV routes. We have one of the best and nationally recognized OHV areas in California, right here in Sierra National Forest. I know there's many on this call, including I see you, Mike McGarity, and others. We've all been fighting side by side for years to protect these routes from closure because they are premier OHV access, and the way that they're managed is very much in balance with conserving the land. And so comparing that to this provides a pretty stark contrast. If Unite the Parks provided us with a map like this and really gave us the details, I think we'd have a much more productive conversation. And if they really had the intent to preserve all of this, like they say, then I think they need to produce a map like this and have that discussion publicly. But that hasn't happened for well over 10 years. I don't think it ever will happen because I do not believe that is their intent. And when you read the language of their proposed legislation, when you read the language of their website and all the documents provided, it becomes very clear this is not their intent for how the range of light would be managed. So what we do know is that there would be some very heavy restrictions on OHV recreation, meaning that only street legal vehicles would be allowed. The Ducey-Ursham Trail would remain intact, which they can't undo because actually the Ducey-Ursham is one of the few congressionally designated OHV routes in the US, and Cal4 and other groups were part of securing that designation many years ago. So if we could do that with other trails, that'd be amazing, but we at least have the Ducey-Ursham. That would remain open, and they do say that many other OHV routes would remain open, but what that again looks like on the ground or comparison to existing use, we don't know. For all those routes, including Ducey-Ursham, only street legal vehicles would be allowed. So that's a massive, massive reduction to OHV access. And so to say that OHV recreation will continue is basically a categorical lie. Logging would be banned. Active forest management and fuel reduction would be very broadly restricted. Mining would be banned. Many existing roads would be closed and reforested. Trails would be expanded, as they say, for hiking. And in their quote, they would carefully manage human and wildlife interaction during the fire season to prevent human-caused fires. And so what that means by translation, again, when you dig into their language, is that public access to the land during fire season, which is the whole of summer and fall, would be restricted or closed. And, we're already fighting the frustrations of management by closure. This would be much, much more severe management by closure. So some other important facts about Unite the Parks. They have been involved in lawsuits against the Forest Service to shut down logging and fuel reduction projects. You can find several out there, but one that I'm referencing here attempted to halt 31 logging projects. And when we're thinking about, Forest Service management now through the Forest Service, I think many of us would say there's improvement to be had. It's not perfect. There's a lot more active management that could be taking place. However, with everything that is being done, I know firsthand that it's a very small fraction of what they actually have approval and intention to do. Because when they get projects funded and approved to go in and log an area or thin an area out and reduce all the underbrush and do some real vegetation management to extract resources for biofuel plants or to log and send resources down to Terabella Mill. When they have approval and funding to do those projects, it's these kinds of lawsuits that stop them from being able to implement with chainsaws and shovels on the ground. And this happens over and over and over. And that's a big part of what's contributed to the densification and overgrowth that we see in the forest now. I think the Forest Service could do more, but I also know that they've been pretty well handcuffed for many, many years. And Unite the Parks is actually one of the organizations that has been part of that handcuffing process. And so when I look at that and I hear there are good intentions stated for how they want to manage the land when it is post-monument status, I have a lot of questions that immediately pop up about what their true intentions are and how they would put that into action, because their actions so far have not proven to be beneficial for the land or the public. Unfortunately, we all saw the consequences of the Creek Fire. Just 4 years ago, we had almost 400,000 acres burned in Sierra National Forest. It was about 32% of our forest was incinerated. And this picture on the left literally almost brings tears to my eyes because it's such a big part of the landscape that I love. I've hiked trails through here many, many times. On the right, we have a picture of that inferno that overtook Mammoth Pools. I know somebody was actually caught in that and survived by staying in the lake overnight because that fire was so strong it burned the whole circumference of the area. And then we have firefighters who are in situations like this. This is an actual picture from the Creek Fire of a firefighter, doing everything possible to stop the forward momentum of this fire, which was just outrageous in intensity. And so when we look at efforts like this from Unite the Parks to stop logging and fuel reduction, and then we look at the results like this, I urge you, go read through their fire science on their website. Reach out to their ecological experts who have provided all the justification behind these reports and ask them questions and see what kind of responses you get. And I think you'll quickly see that their goal for forest management will only lead us back to recurrence of catastrophic wildfire like we experienced in the Creek Fire. So let me pause here. I have another slide, but I think that we've talked about most of this in detail, so I don't need to talk through this slide probably. Let me pause here and see if there were other questions. Dr. Hess, I saw that you had your hand up.
Yeah, is there precedent for going to for a president using the Antiquities Act and then the opponents going to court to at least get an injunction against it to buy time? I vaguely remember that there have been a couple of cases, but I cannot recall them. And I was wondering if you had that answer, because in my mind, clearly the way this game plays out is if there's a Antiquities Act use, you go to court, you get an injunction, and after January 20th, the Justice Department in no way is going to defend the government against to enforce that, I would think.
Yeah, I agree, and I do have every anticipation that if this is designated, that we'll have some action by the next White House administration, as well as the judicial branch and congressional branch to either at minimum pull back or at most completely stop the actual implementation of this monument. But the process of that does get tied up in litigation. And so the most recent example that I can give is Bears Ears. And I don't know if you followed that at all, but there was another about 1.4 million acres. I think it's like 1.36 million acres or something in Utah that was designated by Obama. When Trump came into the presidency following him, he actually reversed that proclamation and shrunk the size of Bears Ears. And then when Biden came in, he re-established and in fact expanded the borders beyond the Obama designation to recreate the full Bears Ears monument. Then it went to management planning, which was done in a pretty accelerated way because they wanted to get that management plan in place before the end of the Biden presidency. I was involved in providing public comment on that. And that's where I know for sure that they had a litany of public comments that advocated to keep current recreational and economic uses intact, and that those comments were ignored in the original plan was ultimately what was written into the final decision. And so then there was litigation that occurred between Trump and Biden, and then post Biden. And in both of those cases, the litigation became very lengthy and costly. And even though we have some very good advocates and supporters at the level of the Supreme Court that I don't think would uphold this if, when, not if, but when these cases reach the Supreme Court. It's the cycle of litigation going through the initial local circuit and then the courts of appeals, and then the process that ultimately bubbles up to the Supreme Court. You don't have cases that just go from day one to the Supreme Court. They have to go through all those layers and ultimately land at the Supreme Court. So that takes time. And then in the midst of that time, whatever happens in regard to what the agency can get away with active planning and implementation of that plan, is where it can get really messy in regard to trying to pull back what was designated and reclaim the uses and access that we had pre-designation. So I think we'd be in a better timeline with the next administration. But we don't know what all that looks like. And we don't know what kinds of lawsuits would be presented and what kind of action the Park Service and monument proponents might be able to move forward with in the midst of our pursuit of pulling things back.
My question is more, rather than waiting until it happens, if we're going to do something, obviously going to the Biden administration is useless. That's a waste of a stamp to do that. Does it help if we approach the legislative side, the Congress?
Yes.
And is there precedent for, there's something that Congress can stop some presidential regulation things that's already occurred. Is that an option to get a foot in the door? Because all you've got to do right now is buy about 2 months. If you could hold the whole thing up in litigation from our side, saying we want an injunction against this happening, that puts us in the control of the time frame. And I guess what I'm asking is, should we be throwing our money at the legal system, or should we be throwing our money at the legislative system, and which one would be the best to stop the process?
Well, I think we should throw our voices at the legislative system. And absolutely, we need to do that. We have had Congressman McClintock come out and make a very firm statement demonstrating his stance against the monument, and that he would make every effort to support litigation against it and to defund it through removing appropriations. And so Congress can decline or remove appropriations to fund a monument, and that would certainly be part of what we would advocate for. But our outreach to legislative representatives needs to start now, and that's part of what we'll be doing. On the litigation side, you can't sue over a monument until after it's designated. And so it is my understanding that there are some groups that are pretty well positioned to quickly activate some litigation to that end. But again, how that happens, I can't, give all the definitions of that. So I would say supporting groups like Cal4 as well as Corva and Blue Ribbon Coalition. I'll be giving some more information about our organizations in a bit. Would be one of the best ways to support the potential for litigation because that's where all the membership funds go. We're nonprofit associations that are not people raking in cash off of memberships and donations. It's the funds are used to support these sorts of fights, and these are the organizations that are the ones that put themselves in those positions for potential litigation. So I hope that answers your question, Dr. Hess. And we will talk about that even a little bit more as we go on. Bryce, you had a question or something you want to share?
Let me unmute. There we go. My question was, do the counties have any standing on jurisdiction as far as, unlike other national forests, the Sierra National Forest is not a federal enclave. There's no record of cession. There's no deed of purchase. So technically the county has jurisdiction and federal government cannot take over jurisdiction. So
Yep. Yeah, great point, Bryce. I'll click to the next slide as I'm talking through this because our local counties, all four that border the proposed range of light monument, are opposed to it. And in fact, Fresno, Madera, Mariposa counties have already issued letters to President Biden to state their position of opposition and urge that he does not sign a proclamation. I know Tulare County is also opposed. I've recently spoken with their board of supervisors. And while a letter hasn't been written yet, they're ready to send one off at any time. And we're in discussion on future actions that will be taken. In regard to jurisdiction, what you state is factual. Ultimately, the counties do supersede authority over any federal agency in jurisdiction. However, it's up to the county to exercise that jurisdiction. And whether and how Fresno, Madera, Mariposa, and Tulare counties may choose to do that, I think is a very big question mark. I know that there is a lot for a county entity to consider in regard to exercising local jurisdiction. If they were to say, there's counties who have done this. So like Apache County is one in Arizona that actually did assume local jurisdiction over Apache National Forest and did so successfully. So they assumed control for management and then basically told the Forest Service, if you want to remain employed, we will utilize your services, but you'll be following our management directives. And they basically did like a massive reorganization so that the county became the jurisdictional authority and those who remained part of the Forest Service worked for the county, more or less. That's a simplified way of saying things. So a county can do that. Our counties could do that. But in a state like California, I just have to be sensitive to the fact that they would be not only sticking their necks out, they would be putting a pretty massive target on their backs and facing defunding at both the state and national level that I think would make them have to scrutinize very hard the survivability of the county in going through that transition process of assuming local jurisdiction and then also recalibrating with all the changes in appropriations from the state and federal entities versus how it's managed within county produced revenues and those sorts of things. It'd be a very complex process.
So back in 2013, El Dorado County did it. So there is precedent set in California. So maybe that's an example we could use.
That would be a good example to use, yeah, for California. 2013, who was governor? Brown?
I don't know.
I should know this.
But I can send you the article.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to look at. I've had those conversations with our local counties, and I think those are good conversations that we need to continue. I'm not sure what the appetite may be for local counties to do that at this time, but if push came to shove, I know it has been discussed, and maybe it's something that would be considered as a more viable option. I can't speak on behalf of the counties. All I can say is that is a possibility, and
it might be like a worst case scenario.
Yeah, I really don't know what their. I'm not going to venture to try and guess what their possible action may be. Just to say that legally, that's a reality. Is counties can do that if they choose to. So our counties are opposed, though. I think that's a huge plus. And if any of you follow Nathan Magsig or Bobby McCauley or Mike up in Mariposa or Larry McCarry and Tulare, they have been longtime advocates and supporters of public access and balanced conservation with economic and recreation uses. And that's exactly what's spelled out in the letter that they sent to Biden. We also have the support of Congressman McClintock. I've shared a statement that he made recently that spells that out. And I know factually that the House Natural Resources Committee is also in very strong stance of opposition to this monument. We have a long list of stakeholders for Sierra National Forest that include not only Cal4Wheel, but also stewards of the Sierra National Forest, California Off-Road Vehicle Association, Blue Ribbon Coalition, a ton of independent four-wheel drive clubs, mountain bikers, hunters, rock hounders, mining, logging, local business owners, mountain cabin and land owners. There's so many more than what's listed here. So we have an upswell of local opposition to the monument, but we need to organize and aggregate our voices to gain more momentum among our political representatives. And so primarily at the state and national level, since we do have some pretty strong local representation already opposing it. So how are we going to do that? There's several channels. I'm going to talk through a call campaign tonight. I also have a letter writing campaign in development. I really was hoping to have it ready to release tonight, but it's not quite there. And unfortunately, email addresses and contact information for many of our representatives is sadly very difficult to find. And so I want to have a more comprehensive list before sending that out. And so that will come as follow-up. Blue Ribbon Coalition, though, does have a current action alert where you can submit letters to a whole grouping of our national and state level leaders. And so I have a QR code that you can click right into that. We also have a local petition circulating that is going to our county level entities, but it may be going beyond that, talking with the petition holder now. And then we have some local rallies that you can attend to build up the visibility in media of our local opposition to this proposed monument. So for the call campaign, to start off, what I've created, and I'll share it in the chat box in just a minute, is just a one-page tip sheet that very basically, and I'm sorry that's going to be so difficult to read on the screen. So while I'm talking, let me go ahead and get it shared into the chat box. So with that, I just need to quick save this, and then I can share it in the chat. Anyhow, it contains a pretty concise overview of some of the key things that we talked about tonight, along with some talking points so that you can feel equipped to have a conversation with a representative or a representative set of staff, should you get them on the phone, or to leave a message. What happens most often when you make these calls is that you reach someone's voicemail. And so, you know, I encourage folks to leave a lengthy voicemail, but if you reach somebody, really have a conversation. I just put that file in the chat. I've listed local, state, and national representatives who support the monument. I will give a caveat here. Jim Costa is listed, and there have been some rumors circulating that he may have made some statements of opposition to the monument, but I called all of my contacts within Jim Costa's team today to check in on this, and none of them were able to confirm that he has either made a position to support or oppose the monument. They have all said that he has not made a statement about the monument, period. I also inquired about, has he reached out to Biden? Has he made any calls to other congressional representatives? What kind of activity has he had? And they would neither confirm or deny that he's had any activity. There was only denial about his potential of reaching out to Biden. So I put Jim Costa in the support monument bucket because if you haven't taken a position explicitly to oppose it, you are essentially supporting it at this point. In the time frame that we have for Biden's presidency and the likelihood that he will be designating monuments before he leaves office, now is the time to make a stance of opposition, and he has not done that. So there is a longer list of supporters from around the state on the Unite the Parks website. And again, you can access the Unite the Parks website from this URL. Right here in the center, just below where the screen is cut off, there's a thing that says that there's 52 representatives that support it. You click on that, it gives you the full list of those representatives. And so if you want to call more, absolutely, I encourage you to. But this is a set of the top supporters with all of their office numbers provided to make it quick for you to just make some calls. Both of our California senators, as well as Gavin Newsom's office, are listed. I know, Dr. Hess, you were saying that sending Biden a letter is wasting a stamp, and I agree with that statement, but at the same time, we have to make our voices heard. And so I really encourage everybody to make these calls, and when the letter writing campaigns come out, to send those emails. I'm going to direct them preferably by email so that we're not wasting stamps, and there's still a written record. But to send those written communications as well, because this is how we build up the body of evidence of opposition. And then if we get to the point that we do have to litigate this monument, this is the evidence that we need to bring to court. And so your calls and your letters, your signing of petitions is very, very, very important, because it shows now that we oppose it. We don't want them to see it designated, and it makes it very uncomfortable for people to move forward with public support. It makes it very uncomfortable for Biden to look at the prospect of designating this monument when he has dozens of others on his desk that he could designate instead. I hope none of them are designated, but certainly not the range of light. So we need to make this as uncomfortable as possible for all of our elected representatives. That's why we call, that's why we sign petitions, that's why we send letters. So hopefully this makes it easy. Some of you may have, I'm certain all of you have a whole list of other points of your own in regard to why you oppose this monument and what kind of impact it would have on you. So I definitely urge you, don't stay confined to what's listed here. State what's going on in your reality and share from what's happening in your community as you're making these calls and writing your letters.
Rose, I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it too late to have like a citizen petition, like a change.org type petition?
We have one, actually.
Oh,
And
okay. I
so,
didn't
yeah,
know.
I'll share that actually in 2 slides from now. So first, let me share the Blue Ribbon Coalition action alert. They actually have 2. So the image on the top, hashtag no lame duck land grabs, is specifically for the Dolores Canyon, or the Dolores monument that's been proposed in Colorado, which is also a very shameful land grab. And my heart goes out to the people who I know are fighting it intensely there, as it is one of the top prospects for Biden's proclamation. So there's that one on the Blue Ribbon site, and then this QR code takes you to another survey petition that they have. Excuse me. It takes you to another automated letter writing campaign that will, provide you with some pre-written content with an opportunity to also add in your voice that opposes not only the range of light, but also other monuments in California and throughout the US. So it's a good representation to send to a variety of leaders to say we oppose all of these monuments. With this call campaign, you would be speaking specifically to the range of light, and you'd be speaking specifically to leaders who are representatives in California. And then with this one, you'd be speaking to a broader set of congressional representatives around the United States about not only range of light, but additional monuments in California and the US, and urging them to oppose all. So both things are very, very important. We have litigation stacking up, not only here in California, but around the US, because of the risk that we're facing with all of these monument proposals. Finally, in answer to the question that was just asked, we also have a local petition that's circulating. And this screen grab screenshot I took from the gentleman who's leading it, Derek Dix, has done a really fantastic job of getting this petition out. It has nearly 10,000 signatures. I think we get to 20 to 30.
Rose, I just posted a link in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bryce. You rock. This petition is directed towards local county leaders, and we already know that we have local county leader support. So I don't want that to dissuade anybody from signing the petition, because again, this becomes part of the body of evidence that can be used in litigation if we end up having to go that route. Additionally, I've been chatting with Derek, and I think that we could circulate this petition far beyond our local counties. And so I'd love to see this number climb into the many tens of thousands of signatures, because when you look at Mariposa, Madera, Fresno, Tulare counties that would be immediately impacted by the range of light, we have many millions of people who are impacted. We have so many businesses and families and homes, and you know, really vested stakeholders here that I think we could see this petition blow up. So I encourage you to sign that. Bryce posted a link in the chat. For future reference, it's also shown up here in blue text above the image. And then finally, there's been a series of rallies being held, many of them up in the Oakhurst area, but I know that there have been some organized at the top of the 4 lanes near Cressman's in the Shaver, Fresno County area. These are also important to go to because it provides a visible presence of opposition. And so the next one's going to happen on the 16th. I believe there's also one already being planned for Saturday, the 23rd. The last one that was held this past Saturday had press attend, and so had some newscasting that took place. And so all that becomes really high value assets for us because we can take those news clips, we can send them in the emails to our state and national representatives. We can keep them in our archives for litigation, and we can circulate them among all of our friends and family and community members that we're reaching out to encourage them to sign the petition, encourage them to make calls, encourage them to write letters as well. So that is what we had to cover tonight, but I'm sure we must have questions or comments. And before I jump into questions and comments, I'm just going to state again, if Deanna Wolf or anybody on her team from Unite the Parks is here, I would love to meet with you because Deanna has had some exchanges with me in comments on Facebook. I think that's highly ineffective. And if we really want to discuss things further, we should meet. So please reach out, rwin@cal4nrc.com. And so any questions or comments, let's discuss.